My name is Melissa Nedved, and I'm in my fourth year of teaching high school math. My first 2 years I taught at a brick and mortar school in South Dakota, and this year and last year I've been teaching at an all-online school in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The school is called Branson School Online, and it's for any student and teacher living in the state of Colorado. Both schools, though, fortunately follow the Common Core standards for the high school math classroom. So today we're going to take a look at what those standards were and how they were implemented into my classroom. Thanks for watching. So now let's take a look at the role that those Common Core standards play in my high school math classroom. As I mentioned, I now live in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and work under what's called the Colorado Academic Standards integrated with the Common Core standards, which is really just Colorado's fancy way of saying their Common Core standards. About 5 years ago, when the Common Core standards were introduced, Colorado did an integration process where they looked at the differences between their academic standards and the Common Core standards and made an integrated version which really is very closely aligned to the typical Common Core standards, with maybe just a few additional standards throughout the K through 12 standard set. So even though they call it the Colorado Academic Standards, it really is the Common Core. Now, what I like about the Common Core standards for the high school set is that it's a large set of standards that can kind of be puzzle pieced together as needed to fit the way that each school presents their high school classes. The traditional class progression for high school math would be Algebra 1 to Geometry to Algebra 2, and then maybe a trigonometry class or a statistics class, maybe some integrated classes in there for those who are lower performing math students, and maybe also some higher level calculus classes or a consumer math class, a business math class. So there's a wide variety of classes that students can take or that schools can offer. So the way the Common Core standards are set up, although they are in some places broken down by class, there are some algebra standards, there are some geometry standards. There are also additional standards like probability and statistics and number sense that can be kind of used to fit or molded into different class settings. And a lot of those important ones can actually be seen in multiple levels hit in different kind of subcategories. So I think that makes it easier because I'm still able to differentiate maybe how I want to put my class together, or my class might look different than another Colorado high school geometry class. But as long as we're making sure that throughout our high school system we hit those standards, it's kind of our own building block process. Now, Colorado has taken with the Partnership for Assessment Readiness for College and Careers, or what we call PARCC Assessment Center, assessment testing tests. So that means that when we do our high stakes testing each year, we've chosen to take the PARCC route. Now, when I was back in South Dakota, we took the other route, which was the Smarter Balanced route. That was the other company that was creating tests that were Common Core aligned. So I have worked with both of them a little bit. Unfortunately, in South Dakota, we never got past just practicing the test. And we did it my first year, and we did a technology practice where we were making sure that the technology worked okay to do an all online assessment. And the next year, so that first year it wasn't even graded. The next year it was graded, but we didn't get the results. So it was more for them to test their questions and to see how students were scoring. So by the time I had left South Dakota, we didn't actually have any Smarter Balanced results. This past year, my school took the PARCC test for the first time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But it's just good to note that that is the route and the company that they've chosen to go with. A nice thing about our state assessments now, following the Common Core standards using the PARCC testing, is that students test on the class they're in rather than their grade level. So for example, my geometry, I actually have students ranging from 7th grade through 12th grade. And anyone who is currently in my geometry class, when they go to take the PARCC test, will take the geometry PARCC test. So they're not grouped based on their grade level, they're grouped based on the class they're in, which I think is a pretty valid way of testing. One process that my school goes through is when we have some data days, we do what's called vertical alignment rush standards. And again, I'll bring that up a little bit later on. But my school does try to work together, K through 12, particularly my high school math staff with my middle school math staff, to make sure we're meeting all these standards. And I'll show you a document we use to do that. So to portray the role of the Common Core math standards in the high school classroom, I've created this little graphic here, and I'll be quite simple graphic. I think it really has the three main facets to successfully implementing standards into any classroom, but in particular the Common Core standards into the math classroom. And this is really, I think, true for all grade levels with the new Common Core math standards, but I'll focus on my role in the high school classroom. So the three facets to a good implication is education, implementation, and assessment. And I'll kind of break down each of those and explain what I mean by that. But by no means is this a linear chart. You hit it once and you're done with it. You move on to the next step. This is a very cyclical process. We should always be educating ourselves on what those standards are. We should always be practicing implementing them and how we can best implement them into our classroom. And then, of course, always assessing to make sure that our implementation is working, to make sure our education is working, and make sure our assessment is a valid assessment. So we'll kind of break down those three facets into the way I portray these Common Core standards into my classroom. So education of the standards is really, really key, and I am actually quite passionate about this because I think we have so many uneducated people when it comes to Common Core math, and a lot of negativity surrounds these Common Core math standards, in my mind, due to uneducated people trying to understand these standards, or uneducated people looking at these standards without trying to actually understand them. So it's really important that not just teachers, but teachers and parents and administrative staff really understand what these Common Core standards are trying to portray. And my understanding of them, in a very broad sense, is that we want to take students, especially in math at the young level, from just memorizing a process to truly understanding numbers. Now, I did not grow up with the Common Core standards. I grew up just following, we call them South Dakota State standards, and we took this STEP test each year as our state assessment. And like most people my age or older, we added big numbers by lining them up vertically, adding from right to left, carrying any numbers we had, adding together our final result, and we had this process. And that process had a lot of steps to it. And for example, what Common Core at the younger levels is trying to achieve is to get rid of that lengthy process with a lot of steps and a lot of room for error and replace it with really understanding what you're doing. For example, thinking about adding big numbers, rounding them to the nearest tens or the nearest hundreds, adding them together, then adding or subtracting whatever you had to adjust to get to that number. Now, that whole process is a difficult process to teach, but once it's learned, having that cannot be taken away. It's going to allow students, as they progress throughout math, to be able to do those processes mentally, to have a good understanding of what they're doing. And then by the time I get them in my high school level classroom, I'm likely going to be able to have students who can easily answer questions like, does my answer make sense? Does it make sense that when I add two numbers together that are each in the hundreds, that my number should also be in the hundreds or maybe the thousands? That, if you make a step in or a mistake in your lengthy process, you could lose those answers. You don't easily understand what you're doing. So in my mind, that's the big push, especially the younger grades, into these Common Core standards. But in doing so, we are changing the way we learn. And a lot of parents are really struggling with that. So not only should we have educated teachers, but I think we also need to make sure we're educating our parents, especially at a young age. I watch a lot of things, a lot of videos, and I read a lot of articles about pro and con Common Core. Like I said, it's something I'm pretty passionate about. But one video I was watching about a professor who was trying to explain the importance of Common Core said that a lot of the issue is parents are upset that they can't help their grade school level children do their math homework. And he said, isn't that right there the problem with the way that we were taught? We only know how to add one way. And if we try to add a different way, we can't help our students, we can't help our children, because we don't know how to add that way. And these Common Core standards, in the long run, are trying to alleviate that, trying to teach students place value, true understanding of numbers. And as they get to the high school level, I think that will make a large difference. One of my main issues with the Common Core standards is I do feel like we had a very rushed implementation of them. They were released. Each state wanted to be the first to get their hands on these new standards. At my school, it was actually before I even started. It was after I graduated college. My school was sending all their teachers to Common Core training, but we were being trained by teachers who had just learned all about Common Core a few months before us and spent maybe a week or two in training. No one had really implemented this in their classroom. No one was speaking from experience. And I think this rushed implementation, you'll see that follow through when we talk about implementation and instruction as well. But one of the faults in Common Core standards, I do believe, comes from this kind of rush implementation. But if we can take a step back and really look at what these standards are trying to achieve and work as a whole as teachers, administrators, and parents to help our children really learn at a deeper understanding, really be educated on what these standards want us to do and follow through with them, and we can make it to our next stage, which I believe is implementation. And the next important facet of really having an understanding of the role that these standards play. Now, most Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry textbooks are going to be, and I quote, Common Core aligned. Again, with this rushed process, I think as soon as those standards were released, textbook companies raced to make their textbooks Common Core aligned, and to do so, in a lot of times, I think it looked like just adding an extra problem or two, or maybe a little extra section in between chapters to approach these Common Core topics, and slapping a sticker that said Common Core aligned on it. In fact, between my first and my second year teaching, we were in a textbook review, and I got to review a lot of different companies' textbooks and to see what they mean by Common Core aligned. I think this is a work in progress. I think we still have a lot of work to do to get our textbooks, or maybe to eliminate textbooks completely if we're really looking at what Common Core wants us to do. But anyways, in my implementation, I do have a geometry textbook that is Common Core aligned, meaning it's already taken all of my lessons and paired them with the standard that they meet. So that's a nice part. I definitely try to go beyond that, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But my geometry textbook is already essentially Common Core aligned. Now, my consumer math and pre-calculus textbooks, however, are not Common Core aligned. So this has been kind of a pick and grab method where I'll follow what's in my textbook as I can and see how what my textbook says might match up with a couple standards and kind of place them together. And this is, again, a work in progress for my classes to really make sure we're hitting all those standards. One tool that we use as my school, and like I talked about in the beginning, my school does work on making sure we're vertically aligned with our standards, is this math standard alignment. So this is something we've started. We have not finished, and it's just a screenshot. But we have a Google Doc or Google spreadsheet that my entire staff can access, and the other high school math teacher and myself are working on completing it. And what we're doing is we've taken each of the standards and we're breaking down, creating what the success criteria looks like, meaning what does it look like if this standard were to be met in a classroom. And then what we will do, we haven't quite got there yet, is include which classes that we offer we hit those standards on. And by doing it in this nice spreadsheet format, we'll be able to easily see if there's standards that we're really hitting, really getting a good understanding of, and those that we maybe need to spend some more time on. Again, the nice part about the way the standards are set up is we can kind of hodgepodge, building block brick this together as we need to make it fit for our class, for our students, and to still fit those standards. So I think this is a nice tool, like I said, a work in progress, but by next year, we should certainly have all of those in place and know exactly where we're at with them. I do think it's important for the students to at least have a reference as to why we're looking at what we're looking at each week. So in my Blackboard class, which is kind of like my homeroom where I can give announcements and I put all of their assignments, I include this week we will address the following standards in each of my weeks in each of my classes. This is a snapshot from my geometry class a couple weeks ago, just so that they can see that, why we're doing this, where we're moving for. Now, also with implementation, as I mentioned in the beginning, the new standards to me really want us to focus on why. How do we know? How can you explain that to somebody else? Not just the process. And the way I was brought up in math was that here's the lesson, here's the notes, now go do 100 problems where you get a single number answer, it's either right or wrong, and you're good to go. And in fact, my state assessments were the same way when I was growing up. My state assessments were almost completely, if not completely, multiple choice. There were lots of times that I could actually come to the right answer without knowing the right process. So those that old process of doing things wasn't necessarily assessing what I knew, but maybe how good of a test taker I was, and if I could work backwards to solve a problem without actually knowing how to solve that problem. So in the implementation of these new standards using the Common Core, there's a much bigger focus on writing and explanation. And that certainly falls into the next category of assessment as well, but I need to always model that when I'm giving a lesson and talking about math, and always making sure I'm giving a good explanation, and that we're constantly working on writing, talking, explaining our math, why we're doing those things. This is just another snapshot from my Blackboard class showing an example of a short writing assignment that I typically could have as an assessment in my class. So this one talked about explaining why, whether a quadrilateral is a square, how you can check that, describe 2 ways you can check it, and then which method is more efficient. So really having that ability to talk about things like checking the lengths of the diagonals, checking the side lengths, deciding if your sides are perpendicular. The process of actually having students write that instead of just doing that really takes it to the next level. And so it's just a little idea of some of the implementation that I do in my classroom to help implement these Common Core standards. And the last facet talked about assessment. Now, these are just the standard assessments that my school does. So we mentioned that we went the park company, where the whole state of Colorado does park assessments. Now, last year we had every student test in all grade levels. And to be honest, our data was very bad. We did not have a lot of students scoring at the proficient level. We had a lot of students scoring very low, and that was a statewide thing. Now, granted, this is a new test, so I just think this is part of the growing pains. I think it's important to not get caught up in those standard assessments. Although I am a huge proponent of Common Core, I really think that the way we're going with math is great, and I think these new standards are a way of getting us to that next level in mathematics. I think we're still working on the best way to assess that. So whether or not that's the park test, I'm not sure, but that's what my state has gone with. And the unfortunate thing, though, is that this year we're actually only testing kindergarten through 9th graders. So my high school students won't all have testing results, and I'll only get to see growth from the 8th to the 9th graders. That's also kind of a work in progress, but that's what my state has chosen to do. Then for 10th graders, all 10th graders will take the PSAT, which is like a pre-SAT test to prepare them for their college test. As 11th graders this year, they'll all take the ACT. Moving on to next year, they'll all take the SAT. So there'll be a little bit of similarity in those tests, a little bit of a way for me to measure growth and to use that data to drive my instruction, but more so just college readiness exams. Now, what works the best for my classroom as far as standardized assessments is that we pay for all of our students to take what's called the Northwest Evaluation Association test, or we call it NWEA. All grade levels take it, and they actually take it 3 times a year. They take it at home on the computer, so it's a little bit less reliable in that way, but it does a great job of breaking down different standards, different topics. You can see where the students fall within each of those topics. It's a great tool to measure growth. So that's the data I go to the most when I'm looking at using data-driven instruction. But it isn't necessarily Common Core aligned, but I can look at all of the topics and again, kind of use that to see where we're missing in those standards. So those are the very formal assessments that my school uses. Within my classroom, I think assessment is an important part to really make sure that those standards are not only being applied in the implementation and instruction portion, but also being followed through, obviously with a lot of formative and summative assessments. My classes are all held via webinar, so I can do constant checks for understandings with having students quickly answer questions in a questions box, use movies and video tools like Zaption, where students can answer questions throughout and it logs all of their responses. Exit tickets and surveys to kind of gauge where their understanding is on a topic. And then, like we talked about, those writing assignments, those projects, presentations, requiring students to really take that understanding to the next level. And that's what, in my mind, Common Core is asking us to do. That's what these standards are asking us to do at a whole different level than what we were doing before. Beyond just, can you give me an answer? Can you tell me why that is the answer? Can you show me how you got there? So those are the three things I think are the most important when looking at the role that standards should play in your classroom: education on the standards, implementation and instruction in your classroom, and assessment to make sure those are being followed through. If you have any questions,